global warming at the time, around 3,000 years ago, an ice-free corridor. As you can see, right here, the glaciers retreated enough to open up an ice-free corridor down Canada into the continental US. The Rocky Mountains created a natural barrier, and so most of the settlement is actually going to go east. And as you can see, these are all of the, what we call Clovis spear points that we find from that period in those little orange dots. And you can see most of those are actually on the east coast. So our earliest artifact from Henry County is actually one of these points representing this initial peopling of North America. And it's, again, about 9,200 years old. And that's the point right there. So what are these points? And when I say people are following big game, how big a game am I talking about? I'm actually talking about the biggest game for North America at the time. And at the time, that's mastodon. So in Virginia, we know that woolly mammoth are around, but by the time that it's populated with people, we really think it's just mastodon and other megafauna, Pleistocene megafauna like giant ground sloths. If you've been to the Virginia Museum of Natural History, I'm sure you've seen a giant ground sloth. The short-nosed bear, what else? The giant armadillo, the giant beaver, a 400-pound beaver. Dire wolf, mountain lions, of course, but many other. These are much, much larger than we get today. And as you can see, these projectile points, as we call them, or spear points, it's kind of a part of a weapon system. It's not just the point itself. These points are hafted onto the end of a small shaft that attaches to a much larger spear shaft. And those are actually either stuck directly into the animal or thrown, but it allows you to keep part of the weapon system intact if that spear point breaks off or what have you. It also allows you to detach it and use it as a knife, and we know that from archaeology. That's how they were used. But as you can see, this is not a one-person endeavor. You're not going to take down a mastodon alone. You're actually going to rely on people, a group, to take those animals down. And so how are people taking these animals down? How are they following one another? How are they organizing in a place like Henry County? So Henry County, we know, was occupied with about, say, 25 people at any one time in this period. We call this a microband. So microbands are groups of related individuals. So think of your immediate family, maybe your siblings and their children, all the way up to about 20, 25 people, following one another around, hunting, and largely living on the floodplains of the major river systems. And so, how are those groups spread out? Well, we know that they were really just using the major drainages. So Smith and Mayo rivers, they're part of the Roanoke River watershed. And so the Smith and the Mayo flow into the dam, which flows into the Roanoke. And so that we know about maybe 2 to 3 of these microbands were occupying the Roanoke River drainage. And at one point in the year, maybe 2 points in the year, they're all coming together at probably Smith Mountain Lake, at around Smith Mountain Dam, the large gap in the mountain feature. And they're meeting up there, to trade and have marriage ceremonies, that type of thing. But otherwise, they're spreading out to places like Henry County, following those river systems and hunting these large game animals. So, what does the archaeology of this period look like for Henry County? Again, 9,200 to 8,000 BC. We have a rapidly changing environment. So it doesn't necessarily look like what today's Henry County looks like. It resembles, actually, believe it or not, eastern Canada, today's eastern Canada. So it's a mixed coniferous and deciduous forest. It's largely occupied by jack pine, spruce, and fir, a little bit of oak and maple and birch. Much, much colder in the colder months, on average 10 to 15 degrees colder throughout the year. You still have glaciers retreating to the north of you, and so you're getting a lot of that cold air coming off of those glaciers and blasting a place like Henry County. And so microbands, they're moving along the Roanoke River watersheds. They're traveling up the Smith, probably from the dam, and then coming back down and then back to the Roanoke. So again, most of the artifacts from this period, very few for Henry County, but they're going to be found on the floodplains. Now, that gives way to what we call the Archaic Period, 8,000 BC to about 1200 BC, a long period of time. So what does that look like? As you can see, the archaeology is growing. Population is increasing in Henry County. Henry County begins to resemble today's environment. It's a little bit colder, but otherwise, the tree canopy looks very similar to today's, maybe an early 20th century's tree canopy. Oak, chestnut, hickory are dominating. The coniferous forest is retreating north, and with it, also the animals that prefer the cold weather environment. So we had bison, caribou, and moose actually in Henry County that at this time, they're going north following those colder temperatures. The mastodon, the last of the large Pleistocene animals, goes extinct about 8,000 BC. But otherwise, people are largely sticking to the Smith River itself. A few, as you can see on the Mayo River over here, but people are really clinging to the river. And part of that has to do with where they're setting up their, what we call base camps. And these are kind of your home camps. And we know that there's one large one in Philpott. We also know that there's another large one around the Smith River Sports Complex. And what you're seeing in the archaeology right here, so Philpott up here, Sports Complex down here, those are your big base camps. But otherwise, people, small groups are going out from those base camps and they're hunting ridge tops, and then they're bringing back both largely white-tailed deer, but also bear, mountain lion, that type of thing, back to these base camps. Now that gives way to what we call the Middle Archaic, 6,000 BC to 2,500 BC. Population, you see a big boom during this period in Henry County. Bands continue to occupy seasonal base camps on the Smith River. We now see, we have the one in Philpott, we have the one at the Sports Complex, and we see a big one pop up in Stanleytown at this period. And what you're looking at is people are investing more in a sort of local resource base. And so rather than traveling extensive long distances, the Middle Archaic is when you see people largely clinging to Henry County, Patrick County, Franklin County for all of their food, all of their sort of stone resources that they're using to make tools, that type of thing. And you see a couple of important inventions, I should say, or arrivals in this point. One of which is the atlatl. Does everyone know what an atlatl is? This is a spear-throwing device. So it's about yay long, attaches to the end of the spear. You can kind of see a demonstration of it right here. But it actually allows you to propel it much harder. You increase the velocity, you can actually increase your accuracy and your range. And so that becomes very important for the way that the archaeology is distributed across the county in this time period. Because one, it allows people to start hunting areas where they otherwise wouldn't. So with a spear, think about throwing a spear at a deer. It's going to be pretty hard and you have to be pretty close. But if you have one of these atlatl devices, you can actually hide on these ridge tops, create kind of the 6,000 BC deer stand. And that's actually exactly what we see. These devices, you really only gain the accuracy and velocity that you can if you're throwing downhill. And so most of the hunting sites in Henry County that we find from this period are on ridge tops overlooking these creeks. They're not on the creeks themselves. Now, one other big indication that we see that people start settling down is heavier objects. So if you're a mobile person, you're not going to carry around a bunch of heavy stuff with you all the time. And so all of a sudden, we start to see things like these big, heavy axe heads, stone axe heads, these grinding stones, or nutting stones, as we call them, for breaking open hickory nuts and acorns. These types of objects indicate that people are starting to be more settled. They're not going to carry those items around. And the points themselves, the spear points become much smaller. Probably an indication that, again, those big megafauna are disappearing and they're largely hunting smaller game at this point. All right, late Archaic period. So we're getting closer, 2,500 to 1,200 BC. This is when you get people who really start to settle Henry County itself. So they're not necessarily relying on Patrick County, Franklin County as much. They're still going out there for resources, particularly hickory nuts, but they're spending more time in the county itself. And we see that with the diversity of archaeological sites, representing more diversified tasks that are taking place here. A couple of things that are kind of iconic of this period, which have been found in Henry County, is we see these large knife blades. We call them Savannah River points. These are kind of your Swiss Army knife of the late Archaic period. They're used for everything. They're about 6 inches long. People frequently find these on the floodplains, but also in the ridge tops. The other thing that's kind of an invention of this period is the steatite or soapstone bowl. And so that's what this is right here. This is actually one from Henry County. And these are an important revolution for cooking technology. And so for the first time, it allowed people to cook directly in the fire. So before, they're placing they're roasting things above a fire. They're using indirect heating by placing hot stones in maybe a leather bladder. But now you can take this big stone bowl and place it in the fire. And that actually has a lot of implications because it allows you to cook a lot of different things that you otherwise would not be able to cook and break down in previous time periods. We know exactly where they're getting these stone bowls in Henry County, which is kind of the fun part, is most of them seem to be coming from Ridgeway and Henry, Virginia. In both of those places, there's big soapstone outcrops. So does everyone know Soapstone Road in Ridgeway? That's exactly why that's named Soapstone Road. There used to be a place called Soapstone Hill where a lot of these were found. Or I should say rejects were found, where they just discarded if they broke it when they were mining it. So this is kind of just to paint a picture for you, literally this is a scene from the late Archaic. This is what this would have looked like in Henry County, particularly again, a base camp on the floodplains of the Smith or the Mayo. All right, that gives way to a point in time that we call the Woodland period in this part of the world. Again, it's 1200 BC to 1500 AD, so a large period of time. And the first period is the early Woodland, and that's a point where we begin to see permanent settlements, things that look like villages and very much act like villages. Most of them, actually all of them, on the floodplains of your major rivers. People start living in these dome-shaped houses on the Smith River, and these are covered in bark, so they're actually pretty heavy. We find the big post holes from those. And one indication for us as archaeologists that people are settling full-time or longer periods of time on the river is we see a great diversity of tools just explode during this period. We see people begin working bone and creating bone cups out of turtle shells, lots of different sort of sewing needles and fishing implements out of bone. We also see the emergence of tobacco being used for the first time in the early Woodland. Those are both soapstone bowls that have been carved from those same outcrops in Ridgeway and Henry. But otherwise, it's kind of an elusive period. As you can see, there's not much in Henry County from this period. And we think that's because a lot of people go to the Roanoke River. They leave Henry County and go to the Roanoke River, so population becomes very low. Now, Middle Woodland period, very important invention for this period that has big implications. This is when we see the arrival of the bow and arrow. So if you look at those projectile points up in the top corner there, you can see they're very different from the ones you saw earlier. The ones you saw earlier are spear points. These are actually proper arrowheads. We see that emerge for the first time around 500 BC in Henry County. So land use, this is kind of a mystery, maybe someone here can solve it, but land use in Henry County mysteriously shifts to the tributaries. Everyone leaves the Smith River and they go to places like Leatherwood Creek, Blackberry Creek, Town Creek. They don't want to settle on the floodplains anymore. They're going up the creeks and settling on high ridges that overlook the creeks. One theory on this is that we get actually a very timely and appropriate theory is a lot of flooding during this period. So as you can imagine, it's hard to settle year-round on the Smith River if you're getting constant floods like we have been over the past few months. So this might be a good parallel to look at for this time period. We also see personal adornment or jewelry emerge during this time period. For us as archaeologists, that is an indication that people are trying to differentiate themselves from others. So a possible indication of rank and hierarchy that's emerging in this time period. This is kind of to give you a glimpse and paint a picture of what these look like. We call them hamlets. So these are small villages, maybe 3 or 4 houses, occupied by no more than 2 or 3 families. All right, finally we get to the late Woodland. For people that know much about archaeology in Henry County, this is probably the time period that you know. This is the point in time where we get the large villages, the large fortified villages emerge on the Smith River. So as you can see, this is a very different picture of Henry County as the previous maps. Population absolutely explodes during this time period. A couple theories why, but one of the main indications is we get the arrival and adoption of maize, corn, as a staple food item that allows people to settle on the floodplains for a long period of time. Now, importantly, it also allows people to store food and survive a very harsh winter if need be. And so that has big implications for whether you can settle a place for an entire year or only part of the year. And so the largest fortified villages that we see in Henry County, again, they kind of pop up in the same places. Philpott, they pop up in Bassett and Stanleytown, and again, closer to the sports complex in Martinsville. Actually, one of the largest ones, you'll see it in a few slides, but it's actually behind Meadowview over here in Martinsville. But one of the interesting things about this time period is people are local, but they're starting to expand out from Henry County again. They're spending a lot of time in Franklin and Patrick County, where during part of the year, particularly the fall, the late summer and fall, they're going up there to harvest hickory nuts, walnuts, acorns, bring them back down to Henry County, and actually store them in below-ground storage pits for the winter. One thing that we see is we also see extensive trade in this period. So we get a lot of foreign materials coming in to Henry County. All right. So since this is kind of the biggest, or most of the archaeological record is for this time period, I'll spend a little bit of time going over what this period looked like for you in this area. So at this time, we get the emergence of distinct cultures. So they're not quite tribes at this point, but you see a set of shared beliefs and stylistic choices that they're decorating similar styles in their pottery, that type of thing. And it's what archaeologists call the Dan River people. And that's because they largely occupied this part of the Roanoke drainage, which includes the Dan River, the Smith River, and the Mayo. So kind of think of it, everyone who's living from Roanoke all the way over to South Boston. That's sort of the Dan River people of about 1200 to about 1450, 1500 AD. So what does this look like? In Henry County, we actually have probably the most archaeological sites from this period than anywhere else in Virginia or North Carolina. It's very surprising. So a lot of people know, a lot of race fans know NASCAR, or Martinsville and Henry County for NASCAR. People in the furniture industry know Henry County for furniture, of course. But believe it or not, there's actually a lot of archaeologists who know Henry County for exactly these sites and some of the mysteries that they pose. The biggest question is, why did Henry County just boom in this time period? Well, we're looking at probably upwards of 500 to 700 people living in Henry County between 1200 and 1500 AD at any one time. So, what do these sites look like? They're very different from over in Roanoke or over in Halifax. They're actually much more nucleated, as we would call them. They're actually very compact, circular villages that actually have a palisade or fortified wall around them. And so that's a big indication for archaeologists that something's going on. As you can see, this is actually many of you have probably seen this. This is the John White watercolor from the Roanoke colony in the 16th century. But this is actually a plan view of the archaeological site called the Belmont site in Martinsville. Dates about 1250 to 1500. As you can see, they're very similar, including this sort of entry feature that appears there. It would have looked exactly like this, a central plaza for communal activity in the middle, but otherwise houses lining the walls. But the palisade itself is the interesting part because it indicates some type of fear of something in Henry County. And what we believe is that it's an indication of environmentally induced stresses at this point in time, because we have the medieval warming period, we have droughts occurring in this region at this time, and so people are probably throwing up these palisade walls to protect their winter surpluses. That's sort of the leading theory right now, is that we know that later on the Seneca and other groups from the Ohio Valley and north are coming into Henry County and raiding this area for those food surpluses. Now, what are those foods? So at this point, we get just a diversity of ceramics. Many of you who've walked along the floodplains of Henry County have probably seen tons of these things. But people are largely cooking stew-based meals. That includes stews that are largely centered around white-tailed deer, hickory nuts, acorns, and of course corn more than anything. But they're taking down these animals with a new type of a very refined projectile point, and we call it a caraway point. So 9 times out of 10, if you're walking along in Henry County and you find an arrowhead on the ground, it's going to look like one of these small triangular points that dates to this time period. Now, in terms of the food itself, we have a great archaeological record from trash pits, storage pits, that shows exactly what types of animals that they're hunting and what types of animals that they're eating. And as you can see, a lot of these things aren't necessarily around today. So mountain lion is a good example. We have a great archaeological record of mountain lion in this area. Of course, the passenger pigeon, Roanoke bass. They're eating a lot of Roanoke bass. One thing that's not on here is American eel that's making its way up into the Roanoke, the Dan, and the Smith. Different types of turtle, and the list goes on. But one thing that's somewhat unique about Henry County that not a lot of other places have is people seem to really adopt fishing as a major way to sustain themselves in this area. And sort of one of our theories right now is that this is one reason why population booms in Henry County at this time period when other places are failing. Again, you're having major droughts in the southeast during this time period. Why is the population going up in Henry County? One thing that we have that a lot of other places don't have is an incredible river system that's exploitable, for lack of a better term. It's easily waded through. You can build fishing weirs. Many of you are probably familiar with the fish dam, the V-shaped fish dam in Martinsville. But the archaeology indicates that people are heavily relying on fish, and we see that in bonefish hooks. At virtually every site, we see that in the net-impressed pottery. So all the pottery that we find is impressed with fishing nets. And then, of course, we find the fish themselves. Now, one thing that's surprising to a lot of people is that at this time period, they actually had dogs. They kept dogs in these villages. There's a couple of theories why. This is actually an image of the excavation of one of those dogs from Richard Gravely's Belmont excavations in Martinsville behind Meadowview. And the funny thing is that they're buried exactly like people. So they're actually in burials side by side with people, facing the same direction and everything. So all indications suggest that they're treated as pets, but likely used as in a more utilitarian purpose as well. These are guard dogs for villages. As you can imagine, a palisaded village, you're going to want something to kind of hang around at night and actually hear and approach, whether it's an animal or a person. Botanicals. Another surprising thing that people don't realize in archaeology is actually we're able to recover a lot more than you think. We're able to recover charred, in some cases very well-preserved, uncharred seeds and nutshells, pollen, through a process that we call, or a couple different processes, but what we basically do is we dump sediment in agitated water. A lot of those botanicals float to the surface. We skim them off, and then under a microscope we identify what they are. And so what were people using in terms of the natural resources of this area? Again, most of it's hickory nut. During the winter, we think that people are subsisting almost 75% of their diet on hickory nuts at certain time periods. They're boiling acorns, they're creating kind of a meal. They're grinding and creating meals out of acorns, and they're using these as very nutrient-rich, again, stews that they're subsisting Another thing that we find in this area that people are clearly using is Yopon holly. Many of you probably have this as an ornamental plant in front of your house. It's actually a native plant in Virginia. But Yopon holly is actually one of our few naturally caffeinated plants in this region. And so a lot of people initially thought that this was basically a coffee beverage of 800 years ago, but that might be true, but it's actually, we have records of it being used in a ritual way too. So this is a great image from the 16th century, a rendering of that ritual around Yopon holly, which they brewed into a tea they called black drink. And black drink was a type of tea, again caffeinated, but it was drinking in excess to the point of vomiting. And as a group, they would all drink this together to naturally purge themselves at certain times of the year. Again, this is a ritualistic purging ceremony. So I'm not sure, I don't think anyone's quite sure of the reasons or the kind of mythologies or cosmologies behind it or belief systems, but we do know that it occurred. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one important thing that gives us an indication that people are living here year-round is food storage. Now, in all of those excavations along the Smith River, we found hundreds of these pits in the ground. And when we did that sort of botanical study where we actually agitated the water to see what was coming out, a lot of it was corn and a lot of it was hickory nuts. So we know that during the winter, they're storing these items so that they're able to survive Henry County's one, dry spells, but two, harsh winters without food constantly coming in. Tobacco. All of these tobacco pipes were found in Henry County, including this nice face one right here. I'll talk about these sort of lines around the aisle in a little while, but tobacco is very important for many reasons in Virginia, as many of you know. But what you might not know is that the tobacco that made Virginia famous, the Virginia tobacco, is not the same tobacco that they were smoking and growing in early Virginia during the Native American period. So when the Europeans arrived in Roanoke and Jamestown in the late 1500s, early 1600s, they tried smoking this tobacco. And they said, this is too harsh, we can't take this. No one in England, they're not going to be able, their palates are not going to be able to smoke this tobacco. And so actually they bring a tobacco seed from Bermuda that they plant in Virginia, and that becomes Virginia tobacco. The Native American tobacco is entirely different. And that's what was smoked in these pipes right here. Some of these are made out of clay, some soapstone. The face one right there is clay. Recreation. This is very important for us because it shows long distance connections to places as far away as the Mississippi River or Illinois, all throughout the southeast. So this is a game called chunky. So I don't know if any of you have seen these stones in the fields of Henry County, but these actually relate to a type of spear throwing game that people would play and gamble over. But it involves rolling these discs, these soapstone discs, on the ground, and typically the men of a village would compete with one another or other villages in trying to throw a spear and knock over that rolling stone as it's being tossed across the ground. But groups, different villages in Henry County, would actually get together, and as far away as adjacent counties, would get together and gamble with one another over this game. Again, it's invented, we think, along the Mississippi River in Illinois, and kind of makes its way through trade over to Henry County. Now, as we kind of get further and further along in the archaeological record, we can begin to kind of create a foundation of information and finally get to something as sophisticated as, what were they believing at the time? How can you tell that through archaeology? Well, one indication you can see here, again, this is the Belmont village behind Meadowview and Martinsville, but they start burying people in dedicated sections of the village. Now, what does that indicate to you? They need a place to revisit people. They want to know where people are after they've buried them. And so for some reason, they're starting to honor their dead in different ways. And we see that in the burials themselves. So these are actually drawings. I'm not going to show you photos, but I'll show you the drawings of the human skeletons that they found, the burials that they found in the Belmont village over here. And these are all oriented north, but can you tell me what might indicate some type of religious belief in these? They're buried in the same direction, exactly. They all have their head facing east. And so that's a great indication for archaeologists that there's some type of belief system in play here. And so it's kind of fuzzy as to what that belief system is, but when you begin to combine all these data, we can begin to start to say, or make connections that we otherwise wouldn't have. And that's, I'll come back to this tobacco pipe. This tobacco pipe, or these tobacco pipes, are very important for this reason, this belief system. We know after a lot of research that this is actually a very widely recognized symbol throughout the southeastern U.S. in this time period. This pipe was found at the Philpott site over in Philpott, and this was found at the Belmont site in Martinsville. As you can see, they're both faces with lines underneath the eyes. And so what archaeologists now know, after about 60 years of working throughout the southeast, is that this is called the weeping eye motif. We see it in every state in the southeastern U.S. And what it's a part of a symbol of beliefs, a cosmology around, think of it as a polytheistic, kind of Greek and Roman gods. Think of a polytheistic society where they recognize, 3 or 4 major deities. And one of those deities is actually what they called the Thunderbird. And so the Thunderbird was modeled after the hawk. And so many types of hawks have this sort of V-shape marking under their eye. And so now what archaeologists know is these what we used to call weeping eye motifs are actually probably these deities, these hawk thunderbird deities. And for some reason, throughout much of Virginia, and throughout Henry County in particular, they only recognize, or at least from what we can tell from the archaeology, they're only recognizing and honoring one deity out of this sort of polytheistic system throughout the southeast, and that's this Thunderbird. So we kind of have to leave it at that for now in terms of belief system, but the latest archaeology that we're able to put together suggests that at least one of those deities was recognized in this area. Now, before we get on to questions, I'll kind of end with what's next. So one thing that you have to look forward to in Henry County is we're going to actually be restarting a lot of this archaeology along the Smith River. So for the next 2 years, we're going to be working on some grant-funded archaeology in a lot of these already known village sites. So most of them, as you know, were excavated in the 60s and 70s. Archaeology has come a long way since then, so we can now begin to complete some of those excavations. A lot of those villages were actually only half excavated. So fortunately, Richard Gravely and others had the foresight to know that technology would come a long way and archaeological methods would come a long way and allow us to return there and ask new questions. So I'll kind of have to, before we share too much, I'll leave it at that. You'll have a press release about this coming out fairly soon, but just know it's something to look forward to. So with that, I'll take any of your questions. Yes, sir.
It was interesting. The Indians looked east in the world. Well, the people up in Parkway and so forth, that way also were the individuals facing east because that's where Jesus was supposed to return.
Right.
But it's interesting that you have the same concept of different people involved.
Absolutely. And we see this all over the world. First of all, you only have so many options for directions of burial, but one thing that seems to align with both Judeo-Christian practices as well as some of these southeastern burial styles, southeastern U.S. systems, is that a possible correlation with the rising sun. So there's the obvious metaphor in Judeo-Christian practices of the rising sun, but the sun was likely an important aspect for these individuals. One of those deities we know is actually a corn goddess that had a lot of connections with the sun. The sun has obvious implications for agriculture, and so they think that there's a possible connection between the corn goddess and the sun itself. So I think that's the current theory on the direction, eastern direction of burials. Yes?
You mentioned the nuts that were so important to diet, but you don't mention
You know, it's funny, we don't see it in the archaeological record. We see hickory nuts, we see walnuts, and we see acorns as the staple dietary sources, nut-based dietary sources. We don't see a lot of chestnuts for some reason. But I'd say about upwards of 70 to 75% of the nuts harvested to eat are actually hickory nuts. But that's a good question, and I don't have a great answer as to why we don't see it in archaeology. It's possible it doesn't survive as well as those other nuts, but they certainly would have been, you know, harvesting that. It's edible.
Another question the mastodon.
Yes.
Why did they become extinct? Did they cut it out?
So there's been a couple theories through time. I think the latest thinking on this is that it's a combination. It's not any one reason, but it's a combination of two things. One, it's the warming trend during the time period. So between 10,000 to 8,000, we get a major warming period. Again, 10 to 15 degrees average in terms of warming. And you know, mastodons are big animals. They're acclimated to colder weather. Not as cold as, you know, for woolly mammoths, but certainly sort of colder weather. And so that warming alongside possibly overhunting is the reason they went extinct. We know that those long spear points, the Clovis points I showed in the beginning of the presentation, those are specifically made over about a 400 to 500 year period throughout the U.S. to take down these large animals. And after the mastodon die, those disappear. So that's a good indication that it's probably related to overhunting as well. But we do have actually butchered mastodon sites in Virginia, believe it or not. One of them is in Saltville, and that was excavated by the Virginia Museum of Natural History between 1992 and 1997, but they actually have butchered mastodon remains there. Yes?
I have two questions. The first one is the round disc that you found. How
Yes.
did you know that they were competing and playing games and gambling with each other? That's the first question. The second question is the little pipes that you found there with the tobacco.
Yes.
How do you know that they weren't smoking marijuana?
Well, we know that, you know, I'll answer the second question first, and I'll go back to the first question. So for the tobacco pipes, our biggest indication as to what they're smoking is to what we find in the archaeological storage pits and other areas of the site. So when we actually go through and take samples to run through that water agitation process and see what types of seeds that we see, you know, we don't see cannabis or anything like that. We see very distinct tobacco seeds. So that's our best indication that tobacco was what they were smoking. And it's the local tobacco, it's not the later tobacco. And your first question, those discs. So those stone discs, our best indication for, you know, people are kind of competing with each other and gambling with one another is, one, we have later historic records that help us out. That when the Spanish were coming through the southeast and when the English were kind of making their way through the southeast, they actually recorded these games. But the other indication we get is the non-local materials. So on a lot of sites in Virginia, we get these stone discs that are clearly traded from hundreds of miles away. And so that's our best indication that, you know, they're acquired in some type of exchange process. And what we think, you know, connecting that with the historic documents is that it's probably, you know, in groups playing with one another more so than just basic trade. Yes?
Do you find any evidence of any kind of art, drawings, or anything like that?
That's a good question. You know, I wish in Henry County we haven't really. The only sort of symbology that we see are in those pipes and that sort of that eye motif. To my knowledge, we have not found any other symbolic drawing in any way. Now we do get, the next closest thing is we do get adornment, particularly in this later period, 1200 to 1500, we get all types of jewelry. Jewelry in the form of shells that are traded all the way from the east coast of Virginia to Henry County, and particularly large pendants that are worn by chiefly individuals. Those are later replaced by native and then European copper pendants. Many of you probably know that 2 burials were excavated in Philpott by Richard Gravely, I think in the late 70s, early 80s, that actually contained some of these later burials that had copper jewelry all over them. 2 women just adorned in copper jewelry. So that's sort of the only type of artistic expression that we found so far.
In the Barker line, it's been my impression, I might be wrong, that the Indians, the Barker was a social event and not an addictive event. Whereas the American came over, the Barker was addictive. It was because nicotine was very, very addictive. Is it because they changed the tobacco, they brought a new type over, or what caused that? What do you think?
You know, tobacco is so abundant in this area. It's not an exotic, or wasn't at the time. You know, it was readily available. You're correct that we do know that tobacco was more of both kind of a social thing, you know, to smoke between groups, but also it was used in ritual purposes. We do not know whether it was recreational or sort of casual as it is today.
It's much more addictive now. Nicotine was very addictive. It didn't seem to be addictive then. They smoked it when they wanted to, a social event, but didn't have to have it every day, every 2-3
Right.
hours. And go to the court to civil legitimate.
Yeah, so I don't have a good answer as to the sort of the nicotine levels at the time or how addictive it was. So it's possible that it was, but you know it's hard to say from the archaeology alone.
The atlatl.
Yes.
First one I ever saw was demonstrated by an Aborigine guy at the museum in Australia about 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
How did it get from here to Australia or Australia back to here?
That's an excellent question. And like the bow and arrow, the atlatl is independently invented in multiple parts of the world at different times. So in Australia and other parts, the atlatl comes much earlier, tens of thousands of years earlier. The bow and arrow comes much earlier. But as far as we can tell, and actually, you know, we're pretty confident in that in the U.S., both the atlatl and the bow are independent inventions here.
Hayden, are these artifacts all stored at the Museum of Natural History, or are you having different places?
So they're different places. We have a few sites at the Virginia Museum of Natural History. We have a few artifacts from the Belmont site. We've got a few sites up from Leatherwood Creek. But otherwise, almost all of Richard Gravely's material is actually down at UNC Chapel Hill in the anthropology department there.
Okay.
So he was donating his material before the museum here in Martinsville was set up for the most part. And so most of that went down there and they curate it for now.
And you have pretty easy access back and
We
forth?
do. It's made available to anyone who wants to do research on it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The
Yes, Matt.
18th century, when the colonists started coming to this area, at what point were the Indians not in this area?
That's a really good question. So, William Byrd's accounts indicate, you know, in the early 18th century that Native Americans were still in this area. What we can tell is this group right here that occupied Henry County, by the late 1600s, they had largely left Henry County. There's one settlement that remains, and that's in Philpott. But otherwise, all of these groups head down to Eden, North Carolina, and they set up a large village. They come together and set up a large, more tribal-looking village at the confluence of the Smith and the Dan River, Saratown. Now, who's still around in this area? One thing that we know, as many of you in the Historical Society knows, the Great Wagon Road goes right through, the Carolina branch of the Great Wagon Road goes right through Henry County. That's built on a much older native path. And so the groups that we see in the historic documents from the 18th century and even into the 19th century are largely Ohio Valley and northern groups coming down that road through Henry County, more so than groups that are actually living here. Now, further towards Roanoke, we do know that there's a few remnant villages as late as the 1800s. But otherwise, to our knowledge, no one's living here full-time in the 18th century. They're native persons living here full-time in the 18th century.
Was Mr. Gravely's research on the Smith River and the Mayo?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, both sides. So we have at least 2 or 3 very large village sites on the Mayo that he excavated, but most of his were on the Smith and up Leatherwood Creek and a few of its tributaries. Any other questions? One more?
I thought it was interesting, 19,500 BC, because I read in a paper that that's the oldest known human remains they found down near Richmond was 19,500 BC, whereas they thought it was the Clovis people out in New Mexico was like 15,500 BC.
So I'd say here in Virginia, we do have I'd say this is really in the past 5-6 years this evidence has come along, but Clovis were certainly not the first people in Virginia. Our best archaeological evidence now suggests that people were around here at least as far back as 16,000 BC. We're fairly confident on that. We have sites on the Nottoway River, one called Cactus Hill, and then also up at Smith Mountain Lake at the dam. We have pretty good indications that groups are there much earlier than Clovis, possibly as back to 14,000 BC, 15,000 BC. So what that suggests is North America was not populated by one wave of people. There was actually multiple waves of people coming over. Even before that ice-free corridor opened up in Canada, people were probably traveling the coast and then hopping over east. But that evidence is still forthcoming. So stay tuned on that. We'll hopefully have a couple new dates in the next maybe year or two.
And there's some suggestion that earlier ones actually came from Europe and across and down. Has been suggested. How much that's proven or not, I don't know.
It has been suggested. We don't have it. Yeah, so that's what we call the Solutrean hypothesis, and that's based on, the spear points look very similar to European spear points at the time. We really don't have great evidence to suggest that. I'd say that's sort of left at that's a theory at this point. It's not very well supported.
Anybody else? Thank you.